Good afternoon. I'm Dan Lipkin, head librarian of the Phillips Library at the Peabody Essex Museum. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that those of us here in Essex County are on the ancestral territory of the Agawam, Pawtucket, Pennacook, Namkig, Massachusetts, and Wampanoag. Many other indigenous communities have lived and moved through this place over hundreds of generations. And indigenous people of many nations live and work in this region today. Please join us in honoring their communities, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. Thank you. We're very glad that you've chosen to spend some time with us today. You are witnessing the first virtual program hosted by the Phillips Library. Over 300 of you registered today, and it is worth noting that we couldn't have hosted this many people in person. We have an exciting few months lined up, and you'll have plenty of opportunities to connect with the Phillips Library and our collections. We are developing more programs like this, and library collections will be very prominently featured in PEM's slate of fall exhibitions, including the Salem Witch Trials 1692, Salem Stories, and My Dear Davy and Chester, a selection of illustrated correspondence by modern artists of India from the papers of Davida and Chester Hurwitz. And this will be the next rotation in the Phillips Library Collection Gallery. In the shorter term, I'm thrilled to announce that the library reading room will reopen to the public in a limited capacity on Thursday, July 16th, and we are really looking forward to resuming our in-person service. For more detail, see the library page on pem.org or get in touch with me or our reference staff at research@pem.org. That's PEM.org. I'd like to thank some of our community organizations for helping us to promote this event, and they've clearly done a wonderful job. Salem State University, the House of Seven Gables, the Nathaniel Hawthorne Society, Salem Public Library, Destination Salem, the Grolier Club, the Tickner Society, and of course, our colleagues at PEM. Special thanks to our PEM colleagues, Karen Boehm, Bethany Beatrice, and Mark Wood for helping us to bring this program to virtual life. Everyone is currently muted, but we do encourage questions. Feel free to type them into the chat box that you'll see on your screen there, and we'll get to as many as we have time for after the lecture. Since we have guests here from 25 states and 9 countries, I'd also encourage you to use the chat feature now to let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear. I'm very pleased to introduce Catherine Robertson, Phillips Library's print librarian, who organized this event for its original pre-COVID March date, and again recently to reconfigure it for this virtual format. She also co-curated our recent exhibition, The Creative Legacy of Nathaniel Hawthorne, the very first in our gallery dedicated to showcasing Phillips Library collections. I very much appreciate all the amazing work she has done to put this event together, to put the exhibition together. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Catherine. Enjoy the talk.
Thanks so much, Dan. Our speaker today is coming to us from his study in Newton, Massachusetts. Richard Kopley is Distinguished Professor of English Emeritus from Penn State DuBois. He has published extensively over the past 40 years on Edgar Allen Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Among his Hawthorne publications are the 2003 monograph, The Threads of the Scarlet Letter, researched in part at the Phillips Library. And this is the Phillips Library's copy. And the 2016 edition of the 1842 novel that influenced the Scarlet Letter, Ebenezer Wheelwright's The Salem Bell, which is available for purchase from the PEM shop. He'll be outlining the detective story that led to this publication today. He's also published a variety of articles and book chapters on Hawthorne, organized a Hawthorne conference in Brunswick, Maine, and helped organize another in Concord, Massachusetts, and served as the president of the Nathaniel Hawthorne Society. He has spoken on Hawthorne in the Netherlands, Italy, Switzerland, Japan, and can now add the digital world to that illustrious list. We at PEM are thrilled to be able to present this program. Richard, please take it away.
Thank you, Catherine, for your making this talk possible. From the initial planning for the in-person version to the present digital version, you have managed this event gracefully and effectively in a very difficult time. I would also like to thank book artist Mindy Beloff, whose book, A Golden Thread, prompted the Hawthorne exhibit. And thanks to the Grolier Club, whose listing of the exhibit led to my connecting with Catherine. Thanks to Karen Bain, Promotion and Logistics, Beth Beatrice, also Promotion and Logistics, Mark Audiovisual, Julie DeWald, Graphic Designer, and of course, Dan Lipkan, the head librarian. Thank you all very much for your work on behalf of this event. And I'm happy to add my thanks to the digital audience for your interest. I'm glad you're here. My talk this afternoon will be a detective story. I didn't know where it was going while it was happening. I had no idea what I would discover, if I would discover anything. Looking back on the sequence of events from years later, I'm very grateful and feel very fortunate to have had this adventure. I'll be glad to take questions and comments after the talk. I didn't always love Hawthorne. I studied the Scarlet Letter in 11th grade, and I remember thinking what a gloomy, depressing book it was. Why would anybody write such a book? But I grew over the years to love him and Poe and Melville as I read more, especially after college. I decided that I wanted to get my PhD in English with a focus on those writers. They seemed the most romantic and the most mysterious. I worked with Leslie Fiedler at SUNY Buffalo and did indeed do my dissertation on Poe. The pleasure of reading, I was learning, involved partly the pleasure of discovery. My talk today will tell of my pleasure in discovery regarding Hawthorne's masterpiece, The Scarlet Letter. And it will be a pleasure to remember with you my archival adventure. I was teaching the American Literature Survey at Penn State DuBois, The Telltale Heart, and The Scarlet Letter. The Telltale Heart, you probably know, is Poe's short story about a young man who is horrified by the vulture eye of a sleeping old man and decides to kill him, and opens the door ever so slightly, taking perhaps an hour to place his head inside and shooting the ray of a lantern onto that vulture eye. And after 7 days, he rushes into the room and kills the old man. Now, The Scarlet Letter is a story of Hester Prynne and Arthur Dimmesdale, who were lovers, and Chillingsworth, who is Hester's husband. She is caught and placed on the scaffold. She has a scarlet letter A on her breast. She's holding her baby. And she is asked by the minister, Dimmesdale, to identify her partner, and she will not. But Chillingworth determines that he will identify that man. There is a chapter in the Scarlet Letter, chapter 10, in which Chillingworth approaches the sleeping Dimmesdale, as we had the young man approaching the sleeping old man in The Telltale Heart. And approaching closer, he rips open his vestment, that is Dimmesdale's vestment, and finds what he has been looking for. We learn later in the book, the letter A graven into his chest. The language in the story and the chapter in the Scarlet Letter is remarkably similar. And I showed that to the students, and they were amazed to see how literature builds on literature. And we would naturally have a conversation of what is the distinction between plagiarism and transformation. Clearly, Hawthorne was transforming Poe. And that happens repeatedly in American literature, as in all literatures. Rip Van Winkle came from a short story called Peter Klaus. Moby Dick has many sources, including a short story called Mocha Dick. What matters is the nature of the transformation. So I worked this up as an essay. I published it in 1995, and I thought this was it for Nathaniel and me. I'd outlined the physical murder in Poe and the spiritual murder in Hawthorne, and I thought, we're done. Well, I was later working on Poe, studying his reviews in the New York Evening Mirror, a newspaper of 1844 and 45. And I came upon his enthusiastic review of James Russell Lowell, a Cambridge poet, especially a poem I did not know, A Legend of Brittany. And the gist of this legend is that a priest gets a woman pregnant and ambitious. He decides to kill her and bury her in the church, and her spirit speaks from that church accusingly. What particularly interested me was the description of the church organ, very much like the description of Reverend Dimsdale's voice in the Scarlet Letter. I wrote up the parallels, but did not submit the work for publication for fear I would jeopardize the possibility of a book. I slid it in a drawer, hoping for another find and another chapter. Well, I was reading Lowell's magazine, The Pioneer. It lasted only 3 issues, January, February, and March, 1843. This is where the telltale heart first appeared in the January issue. We know that Hawthorne received the issue because we have a letter from his wife, Sophia, saying we received the January issue of The Pioneer, but there is nothing of Nathaniel's in it. He would publish in the February and March issues. I read the entire run, and I noticed a book review that was particularly suggestive. A review of a book called The Salem Bell, B-E-L-L-E, Salem Bell, because its plot summary mentions a planned death on the scaffold. And it is a death on the scaffold that is the ending of the Scarlet Letter. So I wondered, well, could Hawthorne have known of this book? I read the Salem Bell on microfiche at Penn State Library. This is a story of a beautiful young woman. She is the Salem Belle, Mary Lyford, and her suitor, Walter Strail, whom she loves, and another suitor, a kind of devious man, untrustworthy, named Trellison, and she does not love him. And after he presses his suit repeatedly, she finally has to rebuff him. And he is very hurt and very angry. The year happens to be 1692, and he takes advantage of that fact, and he accuses Mary of witchcraft. And he is believed, and she is imprisoned. So, in reading the first 2/3 of the Salem Bell, I found nothing relating particularly to the Scarlet Letter. But in the final third, there is a suggestive scene in the forest. Her brother Henry, encourages the miserable Mary and recommends that she escape. Similarly, in the Scarlet Letter, Hester encouraged the miserable Reverend Dimsdale and urges him to escape. The language regarding the forest in the Salem Bell is very close to the language regarding the forest in the Scarlet Letter. For example, according to the Salem Bell, quote, "The wind sighed mournfully along as if in sympathy with the sadness which had fastened deeply on the minds of brother and sister." According to the Scarlet Letter, quote, "One solemn old tree groaned dolefully to another, as if telling the sad story of the pair that sat beneath." Well, I kept reading, not convinced, but hopeful. Then there was a suggestive scene set in the harbor. In the Salem Bell, as in the Scarlet Letter, secret passage is sought on a vessel in the harbor, and a lively harbor scene is described, with comment on the tolerance of the Puritans for the piratical. And the language was similar in both harbor scenes. For instance, according to the Salem Bell, quote, "It was rather wonderful that so much charity was extended towards the captain, considering the very strict morals of the Puritans and the rigid honesty with which they were accustomed to discharge their pecuniary obligations." According to the Scarlet Letter, quote, "It remarkably characterized the incomplete morality of the age, rigid as we call it, that a license was allowed the seafaring class, not merely for their freaks on shore, but for far more desperate deeds on their proper element." Now I was on the verge of being convinced. I needed one more example, and I found it in the final scaffold scene that had been mentioned in the review. When Mary does not appear at the scaffold because she's been rescued, the guilt-ridden Trellison ascends the scaffold, exonerates Mary, and confesses his sin, even as Dimmesdale on the scaffold diminished Hester's sin and confessed his own sin. And the language of both scaffold scenes, including the final speeches, is similar. For instance, Trellison on the scaffold in the Salem Bell says, quote, "Hear me, magistrates and men, and ye ministers of an insulted God. Hear me, old age, middle life, and youth. It was this hand that brought down the threatened ruin upon that child of innocence and love." And he confessed his sin. Dimmesdale on the scaffold in the Scarlet Letter says, quote, "People of New England, ye that have loved me, ye that have deemed me holy, behold me here, the one sinner of the world." And he confessed his sin. I wrote at the top of my page of notes, "This is a source for the Scarlet Letter." I was excited but mystified, for no author was given for the Salem Bell. So began my 2-year quest. A tentative attribution had been published to Lucy Cleveland, and for a while I believed this was the correct attribution. And I remember talking with my family at the dinner table about Lucy Cleveland after I had closed the window. I read everything Lucy Cleveland wrote at the Phillips Library, with much appreciated help from curator Paula Richter. But the Salem Bell did not seem like the highly moralistic children's books that Lucy Cleveland had written. I checked all copies of the Salem Bell at institutions guided by the National Union Catalog and sent letters to the relevant librarians. Most librarians responded that their copy had no markings. But Rebecca Cape of the Lilly Library at Indiana University sent me a photocopy with an inscription from the title page, "By Mr. Wheelwright." There was no first name, but the attributor did write her name, Jane Ann Reed, and she gave her location, Waldoboro, and the date, December 1842. Well, my son Gabe got out our map book, looked up Waldoboro in the back, found that it was in Maine. We looked at the map of Maine, and there it was, on the coast, Waldoboro, Maine. So I had a lead. I checked the National Union Catalog for manuscripts and learned that the Reed family papers were at Columbia University. I went to Butler Library, Special Collections, and looked through a box of Reed family papers. I found a letter from Jane Ann Reed's father, Isaac, to her sister, Mary, about his reading the Salem Bell and wondering if it was historically accurate. and I found a letter from Sarah Derby to Jane Ann Reed's sister Mary, asking, how are Mr. and Mrs. Wheelwright? Do they still live in Dover Street, or have they moved? Well, I assumed there was for this family one Mr. Wheelwright. I consulted the Boston Directory for 1841 and found that one of the 12 Wheelwrights did live on Dover Street. His first name was Ebenezer. And I consulted the Boston Directory for 1842 and found that Ebenezer had indeed moved to 3 Temple Place, which was also the address of Charles Tappan, one of the 2 publishers of the Salem Bell. So I had my man. The review of the Salem Bell and the Pioneer identified the author as a young businessman. Research librarian Fred Birchstead at Widener Library told me to check the Dunn and Company records. This was the antecedent of Dunn and Bradstreet. At the Baker Business Library across Lars Anderson Bridge over the Charles. Tim Driscoll showed me the index to the ledgers, and I found Ebenezer listed. And Tim brought out the appropriate ledger. Comments appeared for Ebenezer every 2 years or so, stating, good for 0, dead as Chelsea. So he was not creditworthy. I then went to the National Archives and Records Administration Library in Waltham. I was looking for material on the Boston Custom House, since Hawthorne had worked there and Wheelwright had worked near there. But I found nothing. The Boston Custom House had burned down. However, archivist Walter Hickey asked about my project, and when I explained about poor credit risk Ebenezer, he asked if my guy had declared bankruptcy. I didn't know. I hadn't thought of it, but it was possible. Hickey went to a back room and returned laden with papers, the bankruptcy documents of Ebenezer Wheelwright. Ebenezer had petitioned for bankruptcy on March 5th, 1842, and was declared bankrupt on May 10th, 1842. The bankruptcy judge, incidentally, was future sculptor William Wetmore Story. So now I inferred motives for Wheelwright's anonymity. He didn't want his creditors to obtain whatever little income he secured from the book, and he didn't want them to know that he was indulging his literary aspiration rather than working as a businessman to make more serious money to pay them back. He was, by the way, relying on the Debtor-Friendly Bankruptcy Act of 1841, which responded to the panics of 1837 and 1839. Another who declared bankruptcy, responding to this act, was Edgar Allan Poe. I went to the New England Historical and Genealogical Society on Newbury Street and found reference in the genealogy section to a lost manuscript genealogy of the Wheelwright family. Downstairs in manuscripts, I checked on material relating to Bowdoin College, Hawthorne's alma mater. And then, as I was leaving, halfway out the door, I turned to the librarian and asked if he'd ever heard of the lost manuscript genealogy of the Wheelwright family. He checked a green plastic index card box and said that he might have something. He went to the back room and returned laden with papers, which he set down at my table. The manuscript genealogy that had been considered lost upstairs was found downstairs. I was just too excited to sit. I left the New England Historical and Genealogical Society and walked quickly through the Boston streets, trying to calm down. I had lunch at Joe's American Bar and Grill on Newbury Street, a hamburger and fries, and I read the Boston Globe, checking especially for news of the Red Sox. Calmed down, I returned to the library, and I remember thinking that I must be the happiest person in Boston. Back at the New England Historical and Genealogical Society, I read the entirety of the manuscript Wheelwright genealogy, and I had photocopies made of the entire thing. A portion of it was correspondence between Ebenezer Wheelwright and the genealogist John A. Vinton. Ebenezer was providing information about his family, though never money, so the manuscript was never published. And at one point, he did write briefly about himself, noting that he had published books, including a novel that had gone into 3 editions titled Traditions of Palestine. So I had another lead. I rushed to the Boston Public Library and found Traditions of Palestine, but it was the wrong one, by Harriet Martineau of the 1830s, not by Ebenezer Wheelwright of the 1860s. So I returned to Widener Library. I was allowed in the stacks and found the correct Traditions of Palestine inscribed by the author. I compared his handwriting with that of a photocopy of Ebenezer's handwriting from the New England Historical and Genealogical Society. It was the same. The name Newburyport was identical in both cases. Ebenezer Wheelwright did write Traditions of Palestine. Back home, I read Traditions of Palestine and found that the story was similar to that of the Salem Bell, only set at the time of Jesus rather than that of Salem witchcraft. It was in anticipation of the 1880 Ben-Hur. Similarities in plot included the triumph of Christianity over superstition or ritual, the escape of a woman from her execution, and her marriage to her rescuer, and an abiding and intense guilt by several of the characters. Some of the phrasing in the Traditions of Palestine corresponded with that of the Salem Bell. Ebenezer Wheelwright had written both books. I drove to our Old South Church in Newburyport, and with the help of George Hardy, found a newspaper serial of Traditions of Palestine, published before the book. During other visits to Newburyport, I went with my family to Ebenezer's house on High Street and to the graves of his wife and of himself. Later, attending a conference in Los Angeles, I visited the Huntington Library in San Marino. This is a gorgeous library in the midst of a fabulous garden. This is the only place I know where the cafeteria gives a discount if you're a scholar. At the Huntington, I found another letter from Wheelwright, identifying himself as the editor of an 1867 religious magazine known as the Panelists. Remarkably, later checking the magazine back at Harvard, I found that one issue featured an ad for Traditions of Palestine and an excerpt unidentified from the Salem Bell. This was, by the way, a wonderful trip that I made with my son Gabe, and we took in a Red Sox game and had a memorable lunch at Bartley's Burger Cottage. So I subsequently went to the Boston Public Library's microfilm division and found 24 contemporary reviews of the Salem Bell, mostly from newspapers, a few from magazines. Some positive, the Salem Bell is a simple and beautiful tale and is beautifully written. Some negative, we have perused this book as closely as its inordinate dullness would allow. Some admitted the excesses of the Salem witchcraft time, others defended the Puritans. I wondered how Hawthorne had known of Wheelwright. A likely answer is through his sister-in-law, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, who knew the world of Boston publishing, or James Russell Lowell, his friend who had probably written the review in the Pioneer. Also, Hawthorne went from Concord to Boston in late October 1842. It would seem probable that he would have visited the publisher of his children's book, Historical Tales of Youth, the same as the publisher of the Salem Bell, Tappan and Dennett. The Salem Bell was copyrighted in November 1842, so I presumed that it was published then. Therefore, when Hawthorne visited his publisher, they would have told him of a forthcoming book about Salem. But when I gave a talk at the Phillips Library 15 years ago I learned more. Librarian Irene Axelrod brought to the talk a small book, which I imagined was a copy of the Salem Bell that I had seen. After my talk, she passed it to my daughter Emily, who raised her hand. I called on her, young woman, and she came up to the podium announcing a new discovery. I had no idea what was up. She put on the podium an uncatalogued copy of the novel, one I had never seen, and read the inscription on the title page. Miss H.F. Gould, that was a famous poet of Newburyport, Miss H.F. Gould, with the kind regards of E. Wheelwright, October 1842. Well, this was the first time I'd seen Wheelwright's signature in the Salem Bell. And also, evidently, the book had appeared before the official copyright. So when Hawthorne appeared at Tappan and Dennett in late October, they already had the book, The Salem Bell, and would probably have just given it to him. I later checked the 3 other uncatalogued copies of the Salem Bell at the Phillips Library, and none of them had any markings. I asked Irene Axelrod why she had brought that particular copy, the only one of the uncatalogued 4 with markings, and she said, it had a purple cover. I like purple. There was also, by the way, another edition of the Salem Bell in 1847. So the book must have had a modest success. There was still a mystery, though. I wondered why Hawthorne had relied on the Salem Bell at all. He didn't need it, but he used it. Why? My first answer is that the anonymity of its author allowed Hawthorne to create a subtext. Hester Prynne is twice compared to Anne Hutchinson, the female leader in the antinomian controversy of 1630s Massachusetts Bay Colony. The antinomian controversy was a conflict between the government, led by John Winthrop, and Anne Hutchinson. The government, led by John Winthrop in particular, espoused the covenant of works. He said, we know we are saved if we have success in this world, power and wealth and position. But Anne Hutchinson said, no, I believe in a covenant of grace. We know we are saved in this world if we have an inner spirit, regardless of what wealth or power we have or don't have. Well, so Hester is compared to Anne Hutchinson, but who was Dimmesdale? The secret author of the Salem Bell offered the critical clue. Ebenezer Wheelwright, author of the Salem Bell, was the great-great-great-great-grandson of John Wheelwright, Anne Hutchinson's partner in the antinomian controversy. John Winthrop's journal conveys his antipathy to both of them, and his eventual trial of Wheelwright and Wheelwright's expulsion, and then his trial of Hutchinson and her expulsion. So Hawthorne could have been retelling the story of the antinomian controversy. When I would teach American literature back at Penn State DuBois, I would provide excerpts from Winthrop's journal so the students would learn about the antinomian controversy and then recall it when a few months later we got to the Scarlet Letter. Still, I wondered, was a secret representation of the antinomian controversy sufficient reason for Hawthorne's reliance on the Salem Bell? There must be something else. I remember walking with my daughter Emily in our neighborhood in State College, wondering about this out loud. It turns out, I would argue, there is a second answer. For the Scarlet Letter is, I believe, a double allegory. Bear in mind that Dimmesdale's first name is Arthur and his initials A.D. Adulterer, yes, but something more. And Hester is another name for Esther, So we have A and E. They both sinned and were punished. And their daughter Pearl was, according to Hawthorne, worthy to have been brought forth in Eden, worthy to have been left there to be the plaything of the angels after the world's first parents were driven out. Consider, too, that John Wheelwright and Anne Hutchinson, in the first major conflict of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, disobeyed religious authority and were expelled. The historical allegory intimates a biblical one. The theme of Hawthorne's work throughout his career was the fall and its consequences, including eventual redemption. Through the Salem Bell, Hawthorne worked out that theme most hermetically and most beautifully. So, with my essay on the Salem Bell, I had enough for a book, The Threads of the Scarlet Letter, published by the University of Delaware Press in 2003. Later, I was able to publish with Penn State Press in 2016 an edition of the Salem Bell itself, with my introduction and annotations and with the reviews. And the name of the previously anonymous Ebenezer Wheelwright appears on the cover and on the title page and on the spine. And so I return to the pleasure of discovery. A consequence of my finds is my increasing admiration for the artistry of Nathaniel Hawthorne. And yet another consequence is a very satisfying illusion that perhaps Nathaniel Hawthorne, even after all these many years, has become a friend. Thank you for your interest.
Thanks so much, Richard. So thank you all for listening. We do have several questions, and I'm going to ask. Please feel free to continue to send them in the questions box or in the chat. Richard, we'll start with, where is the grave of Ebenezer Wheelwright, and is it open to the public?
It is open to the public. I needed some help finding it. It's on a relatively steep incline in a cemetery in Newburyport. There is a museum of old Newbury, and I'm sure people there would help anybody interested in finding the grave at the Newburyport Cemetery.
Excellent. And then we have another question, a little bit more in depth. Can you speak a little bit about the religious or humanist motivations of Hawthorne and Wheelwright? What did the Puritan legacy mean to Wheelwright in the more secular 19th century? And did Hawthorne follow a similar line? There's a lot there, so if you need me to repeat it, absolutely.
Wheelwright was more doctrinaire than Hawthorne. There was something called the Westminster Catechism, which he believed in. And he was said to be a very genial man, but dragged down by the gloominess of the Puritans who were his ancestors. So he gave great weight to the Puritan past and to their thinking, and he was pious. Hawthorne was a spiritual man, but he was not a church-going, pious fellow. He certainly was fascinated by the Puritans. His own family roots were in Puritan history, and he studied them, and he wrote about them. And he probably had he probably agreed with a traditional Christian view, but he wasn't devout in the way that Ebenezer was devout. So they overlapped, and I would consider Hawthorne more modern, more flexible than Ebenezer.
How does Hawthorne's Hester compare as a heroine with Wheelwright's main character, which I believe is Mary? Is that correct?
Right, yes. Mary, you meet Hester when she's standing on the scaffold. she's already borne down by the weight of public scorn and potentially shame. Sometimes it seems like she's ashamed, sometimes it seems like she's not at all ashamed, but certainly the weight of the public is against her. So she's already had a rough time. Mary Lyford in the Salem Bell is light and buoyant in the Salem Bell, and it's only about 2/3 the way in when Trellison accuses her of witchcraft, and the accusation is believed and she's imprisoned, that she becomes weighed down, and is as weighed down as Dimmesdale was, needing her brother's support as Dimmesdale needed Hester's. So we have Mary for a while lighthearted and enjoying life, as we seldom do Hester. But by the end of the Salem Bell, they're both worn down. However, Mary will escape, and she will live life with her fiance, her husband, happily, whereas, of course, Hester's partner, Dimmesdale, dies, and we don't know how Hester's life went. We are led to be hopeful that her daughter Pearl enjoyed some success in her life, perhaps married, perhaps gained great wealth, but there would always be a kind of solemnity and weight for Hester.
I just have a follow-up question on that. Obviously, Pearl is a major component in the Scarlet Letter. Does Mary have a child in the Salem Bell?
No.
No. Okay.
Hawthorne wanted to tell the story of an original sin, that is the story of the fall. So in the Scarlet Letter, the original sin is the adultery. Wheelwright was not focused so much on that as he was on Salem witchcraft. It was 1842, 150 years after 1692, and he wanted to explore the difference between superstition and piety.
We have a clarification question. Did Hawthorne work in the Boston Custom House or the Salem Custom House?
Both.
Okay,
Early
great.
on in the Boston Custom House, I think he was in charge of weights. And later on in the Salem Custom House, where he had a higher position, but as many in the audience probably know, he was fired. And this was a very public humiliation, and he was very angry. But his wife, Sophia, said, "Now you could write your book." And that was the Scarlet Letter.
Sometimes bad things happen for a reason, I guess. We have someone asking, are you working on any other potential sources for parts of other Hawthorne works?
I'm not. It would be fun, but my focus now is a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. And that's got me absorbed full time.
I have a question from Alex Hammond. Can you outline how your findings after prior understandings of Scarlet Letter sources in Hawthorne's scholarship? How your findings alter prior understandings? So how did this affect and change what you had previously understood of the Scarlet Letter?
Yeah, well, Alex is right that there are many known sources. There were, when I was working, many known sources for the Scarlet Letter, and in fact, I list them in my book so that they're all in one place. I think what finding the Salem Bell does is clarify in a new way Hawthorne's method of composition. That is, he was using secret information that he knew to convey a subtext, in fact, a double subtext. There are many sources for the Scarlet Letter, but I don't know any one of them that does precisely that. Also, sometimes the sources are noted that are famous. The Salem Bell was fairly obscure, but we should remember that Hawthorne read obscure works, and it was certainly part of his method to rely on them where he thought they could be helpful. So thank you, Alex, for the question. I grant the importance of all the previous sources and any new ones that are found. I would say that the Salem Bell clarifies specifically the nature of the composition and how a secret, which might have been construed as merely an object of antiquarian interest, the name of the author, turned out to be key for Hawthorne's use of the book.
So I think we have time for a few more questions. What intrigues you most about authors like Poe and Hawthorne?
The combination, what intrigues me most is the combination of the engaging story that one experiences on a first reading of a work by Hawthorne, of a work by Poe, and the depth beneath that story. When I would talk to my students, I would say, think of your best friend. Think of what you thought of that person when you first met him or her. Now think of what you think of that person now. What's the difference? Maybe some students would say something, but even if they wouldn't say anything, they're all thinking about that tremendous difference between a good friend when we first met that person and a good friend after years. I said, that's the difference between first reading a great work and reading it again and again and letting it become a good friend of yours. The complexity, the depth, the intricacy that were not apparent on first reading become apparent. And that is particularly the case for Poe and Hawthorne, and I would say Melville as well.
So I think my last question here is from Dan Lipkin, actually, our head librarian. You've been in a lot of libraries. Do you have a favorite reading room?
Oh. The reading room at the old Phillips Library was fabulous. I loved the reading room at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, the reading room at the New York Historical Society, the reading room at the Library of Congress in the Manuscripts Division, the reading room at the Library of Virginia. I'm thinking of places where I made discoveries, and inevitably those discoveries color my memory of those reading rooms. The reading room at the Huntington. These were places where I would find something and I'd look up and I'd look around and nobody knew what had happened. It was a sort of my secret pleasure, and they probably had their own secret pleasures. So in my research experience, those are some of the best places. I would also mention, by the way, University of Iowa Library, University of Texas Library, Indiana University Library. I've been to a number, and the ones I've mentioned have been some of the best. But I should also mention that sometimes the obscure libraries, the little county historical society, might be tremendously valuable, have material that no major library would have. So I'll just give a shout out to those small libraries too.
Definitely. All right, I think we'll turn it back to Dan Lipkin to wrap us up. Thank you so much, Richard. Everyone's been really thrilled in the comments and the questions, so much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Dan, you're muted.
Thank you very much. So Richard, one quick question for you. Do you have a favorite Nathaniel Hawthorne novel?
Well, it would be The Scarlet Letter. After that, it would probably be Blithedale, and third would come House of the Seven Gables, and fourth, The Marble Fawn. And I'm also a fan of his short fiction. I mean, great stuff, you know, Wakefield and Rappaccini's daughter. I mean, amazing, amazing stuff.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Richard, and we really appreciate your time and your expertise. This is really enjoyable. I hope everybody had as much fun as I did listening to you, and many thanks also to Catherine and Bethany and Mark, and to all of you for spending some time with us this afternoon. I hope to see you soon at the PEM and at the Phillips Library, and I hope you all have a great evening. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
Bye-bye.